Right, I think we can get started. So hello everyone, I'm Susanna Fleiss from the TreE PlaNat research project, which is looking at woodland creation. And we're here to present our first webinar today. We're very excited about that. So we're going to provide you with an introduction to the research project, and we'll hear from our project partners, Sam Lattaway at the National Forest Company and Saul, Herbert and Fran at the Woodland Trust, about their experiences of using natural colonisation to create woodland, to provide a bit of context, and hear from some people who are creating woodland in practice, as well as our side from the research perspective. So I think we can get started. Before we do, I'll just say that we'll go through the presentations and then have questions at the end. So if you can post questions in the Q&A function, which you should find along the top bar of Teams, that would be great. But we will also monitor the chat in case you want to post anything there. And this webinar is being recorded, and we'll make it available on our website after the event. Okay, thank you very much. And without ado, we'll start with Elisa Fuentes-Montemayor, who is leading the TreE PlaNat project.
Thank you, Susanna, and hello everyone. It's very exciting to see lots of people attending today's webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. So yeah, I'm Elisa Fuentes-Montemayor. I'm a senior lecturer in applied ecology at the University of Stirling, and I'm also the principal investigator of the TreE PlaNat project. And today, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to our Treescape Expansion through Planting and Natural Colonisation project, or TreE PlaNat for short. And just a bit of context in terms of where this project comes from. So it originates mainly from recognizing the challenges of scaling up tree planting at the level that is required to meet the UK's ambitious woodland expansion targets, and from seeing the potential of natural colonisation to complement tree planting and unlock woodland expansion at scale. But also it comes from acknowledging that these are very different approaches, likely to have very different outcomes and to be used by different kinds of land managers for different objectives. So these are the kinds of questions that our project is investigating. Susanna, if you can go to the next one, thank you. Before I get into our work plans, just a quick introduction to the project team, which includes academics from the University of Stirling, Edinburgh, Royal Holloway, and researchers from Forest Research, all of us with combined expertise in conservation science, landscape ecology, remote sensing, forest biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, and also environmental sociology. But we also have, as part of our team, practitioners from National Forest and Woodland Trust, who have hands-on experience in woodland creation and management in the UK. And we also have support from a range of other organisations that sit in our project advisory group, and we are funded by the UKRI's Future of UK Treescapes programme. Next one, please, Susanna. So before I talk more about natural colonisation, I thought it'd be useful to present this animation created by my colleague Kevin Watts, who I think is probably in the audience. And so this is just to illustrate what natural colonisation actually is, and to highlight the difference with natural regeneration, which is a term that's perhaps more often used by people. So if you can click on the animation, Susanna, so everyone can see that these two processes occur when trees develop naturally in the wild from seeds. But in natural regeneration, this occurs in existing woodland or in recently deforested land, whereas natural colonisation is when trees colonise new areas naturally, aided by, for example, by wind or by animals who disperse these seeds. Next one, please. So this other animation is just an illustration of Natural colonization is a 30-year time lapse that shows an area that was previously arable land, which was then seeded with grass and managed as open grassland until 2006. And then management ceased and trees were allowed to colonize naturally. So this is Hocking Estate, which is a Woodland Trust site in Kent. And I think Fran is going to be talking in more detail about this particular site later on to illustrate how natural colonization has been used and is being used by the Woodland Trust to create new woodland. Next one, please. But natural colonization doesn't work everywhere. Indeed, leaving an area of land to be naturally colonized by trees can be risky, and nothing may happen for a long time. And we know some of the factors that determine the success of natural colonization. So, for example, proximity to seed sources, such as existing mature trees in nearby woodland or in hedgerows. It's a very important factor, and previous studies have shown that density of naturally established trees typically peaks at 20 to 30 meters from existing seed sources. Then local soil conditions and existing habitat is also a very important factor, and we know that natural colonization is more readily achieved on sites with nutrient-poor soils and well-drained soils where competing vegetation is sparse. Herbivory levels are another very important factor, and although this is very strongly dependent on the landscape context, in most instances, grazing and browsing pressure from livestock and other animals such as deer and rabbits will have to be substantially reduced, at least during the early stages of natural colonization, to achieve sufficient levels of tree establishment. And then, of course, time. And trees can start establishing relatively quickly within the first 5 to 10 years, leading to canopy closure within a few decades, but this is very variable depending on the combination of factors that I've mentioned before. Next one. So there are many benefits of creating semi-natural woodlands by planting trees. But since today we're talking about natural colonization, I thought I'd highlight some of the potential benefits of natural colonization contrasted with tree planting. So while tree planting requires nursery stocks, which may not be genetically diverse or locally adapted, and which can lead to high tree mortality if they are badly sited. In contrast to this, naturally colonized woodlands are subject to natural selection processes, leading to the establishment of more robust trees, which are well adapted to local conditions, with higher genetic diversity, which is likely to provide resilience to future disturbances. Natural colonization is also likely to result in a more diverse habitat structure of higher biodiversity value than woodlands which have been planted typically in a more uniform manner. And there are also potential benefits of blending these two approaches by, for example, planting small clusters of trees in what's called applied nucleation, or by planting low densities of trees and then letting natural colonization to fill in the gaps. Or alternatively, also by starting with natural colonization and then using supplementary or enrichment planting to increase tree densities or to introduce tree species of particular interest. But I wanted to highlight that these are potential benefits of natural colonization, and there's actually very little empirical evidence to date of the outcomes of woodland creation approaches that incorporate natural colonization. And the evidence that exists mostly comes from tropical regions, which have quicker habitat successional rates and where landscapes have not been as heavily degraded as in the UK. But we do have some great examples here in the UK where land managers have been trialing natural colonization and blended approaches, and we're going to be hearing more about that from some of our other speakers today. Next one, please, Susanna. So to address some of the knowledge gaps that I have mentioned, in the TreE PlaNat project, we are assessing stakeholder perceptions and socio-ecological consequences of woodland expansion approaches spanning the planting to natural colonization continuum, with the ultimate aim of demonstrating how tree planting and natural colonization can be used in combination to scale up woodland expansion for a range of objectives on agricultural land. And we will do this through a combination of social science and ecological research. If you go to the next one, please, Susanna. So in addition to the knowledge gaps that I outlined before, we also have a poor understanding of land managers' attitudes towards woodland creation approaches other than tree planting, and it's not clear which kinds of land managers already engage or are likely to engage with woodland creation through alternative approaches that incorporate natural colonization. So the first component of our project focuses on understanding the perceptions and the objectives of a diverse range of agricultural land managers for using woodland expansion approaches along the planting to natural colonization continuum, and to understand how this varies with their socioeconomic and ecological context. Next one, please. We will also quantify some of the outcomes, so the socio-ecological outcomes of these woodland creation approaches by looking, for example, at income potential and well-being value, biodiversity benefits, ecological function, and resilience of woodlands that have been created through planting, natural colonization, and blended approaches. Next one, please. And very importantly, we want to integrate this knowledge and explore the links between land managers' objectives, the approaches that they use to create woodlands, and the socio-ecological outcomes derived from these woodland creation approaches. And in the next few slides, I'm just going to tell you very briefly a bit more about what we're doing and how in each of these work packages. So for the social science work, we are using a combination of broad surveys and in-depth interviews to identify patterns of perception and preference, and to gain a better understanding about landowner decision-making processes, and to identify specific knowledge and support needs across land managers types. Next one, please. For the ecological research, we will focus on 5 components which we think are of interest to land managers, and we have identified this based on scoping work that has been conducted by Forest Research, and also based on discussions that we have had with our project partners, Woodland Trust and National Forest. So firstly, we will measure tree biomass using LiDAR and also typical field techniques. And this is as a proxy for income potential, which could be through, for example, timber extraction or carbon credits. And these surveys will also give us information on forest structure. Plus, we will use a diversity of other techniques to survey plants, moths, birds, and other vocalizing animals to quantify the biodiversity value of these woodlands. Next one, please. We will also assess woodland condition and quantify herbivory damage and predation pressure on insect herbivores, and use Earth observation data to explore canopy dynamics in response to previous drought events as a metric of resilience. And finally, we will also collect information on well-being benefits derived from woodlands. And to do this, we are exploiting two unique and complementary networks of woodland creation sites across the UK. And these include planted sites, which we have identified using historic maps as part of two other projects, the REN and Res Rico projects that you can see in the map as red triangles. And also, we will be using woodland creation sites, which have been created mainly through natural colonization, assisted with varying degrees of tree planting. And these sites have been identified with digital spatial data sets of woodland grant schemes and Earth observation data sets as part of a scoping study on natural colonization that's been led by Forest Research. And you can see those sites as blue dots in the map. Next one, please. So we will survey 35 of these sites, and they will be split broadly into 4 categories, going from purely planted to purely naturally colonized sites, and a mixture of these approaches. And these are broadleaf and mixed woodlands ranging in age from about 20 to 30 years, and they're located in and around the National Forest area in central England. And the next slide just shows an example of one of the natural colonization sites that we are using. This is Hainault Forest in 1999, 2008, and 2022. And I think Saul will be telling us a bit more about this particular site and other sites managed by the Woodland Trust, which incorporate a degree of natural colonization. But first, I'm going to hand over to another one of our project partners, Sam Lattaway from the National Forest, to tell us a little bit about their experience using natural colonization on their sites.
Thanks, Elisa. So I'll just start, if we go to the next slide, please, Susanna. So I'll just start with a very brief introduction. So I'm Sam Lattaway. I'm the head of land policy and research at the National Forest Company. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. So for those that don't know about the National Forest, it's a project that's been running for just over 30 years in the English Midlands, really set up as a tree planting led project to create a new forest for the nation. Can we go to the next slide, please? So to give you an idea of where we are and what we've achieved, where we started from, we're very much in the centre of the country. We literally have a spot that's supposed to be the furthest from the sea in England. We cover the counties of Leicestershire, Derbyshire and Staffordshire, and in total about 200 square miles. For context, 30 years ago when the project started, the central belt of the blob you can see on the map there was heavily influenced by coal and clay extraction. At the eastern and western extremes, we had remnants of ancient forests in Charnwood and Needwood, but in between was pretty much devoid of woodland. The area had been affected by well over a century of increasingly industrialised coal mining, both deep mining and open cast. So really it was a project about repairing a whole landscape, which is why initially it was led by tree planting. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this gives an idea of just some of the things we've achieved over the last 30 years. I think particularly of note, over 9 million trees planted. We're approaching 9,000 hectares of woodland and other habitats. When we talk about the National Forest, it is very much a forest approach. It's woodland led, but we are also creating non-woodland habitat, open parkland, wood pasture, heathland, natural grassland, ponds, the whole range. And we're also very much around the social and economic side as well. So you'll see some figures here around tourism support and community engagement, environmental learning. So we're really trying to deliver the three main stools of sustainability within the National Forest. Can we go to the next slide, please? So numbers are great, but I love maps. Maps are better. So when we started 30 years ago, you can clearly see the coal field in the middle, very little woodland at all. Our one ancient woodland that was left, if you can see the large green blob just to the west of where it says Overseal, that was pretty much the only ancient woodland we had left in the coal field area. But you can clearly see the remnants of Charnwood and Needwood at either end of the forest, and also in the north towards Derby, the area around Cork Abbey had some good remnant woodland there. But if we jump forward 30 years to the next slide, please, you'll see that there's been a huge change. We've gone from 6% to 22% forest cover. And that's almost entirely been led by planting. And that has really been driven by grant mechanisms to private landowners, to local authorities, to NGOs. And that's made that big difference on that map. But we do own some land ourselves, and that's given us much more flexibility to try new things. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this is one of our sites called Swannymote, which is in Charnwood Forest. This is a site we acquired in 2005 and planted primarily over the 2005-06 and 2006-07 planting seasons. But the relevant areas for today are the yellow blobs on that map. The adjacent woodland is a SSI ancient woodland, and we took the decision to see what natural colonisation could do adjacent to a really prime seed source. So we looked at this, we looked at the factors of what we could deliver. So there's some areas where we were further from existing woodland. We looked at tree planting there, but really we wanted to experiment with this. And 30 years later, we're now, 30 years later, sorry, I got my times wrong. 17 years later, we're now working with Forest Research on these natural colonisation plots to really understand how they function in themselves, but also the difference between natural colonisation and planting on the site. And moving forwards, we're developing internal protocols and policy for how not only we want to use natural colonisation, but actually how we can promote it to other landowners within the forest. Can we jump to the next slide? So we want to have greater use of natural colonisation for all the benefits that Elisa set out a few minutes ago. We want to include that very much on the land that we acquire and plant, but that's a very small amount. So of the 9,000 hectares of forest creation that we've got, we currently own somewhere in the region of 500 to 600 hectares. So it's a very small amount. So what we really want to do is look at how we can better fund natural colonisation through our grant mechanisms with private landowners and third parties. But there's challenges for this. There's things that have held us back. And this is where projects like this are so exciting, because they can help us fill in these gaps that we need to better understand not only how we do it well, but also to communicate what we're doing. We are funded by DEFRA. We're an arm's length body of DEFRA, and we're also funded through the Nature for Climate Fund. And as you would expect with public funds, we are required to report against that. Part of that reporting requires the recording of numbers of trees planted. So we need to have something reliable and evidence-led that will be able to tell us what we can expect in terms of trees per hectare from natural colonisation plots. We need to understand increasingly as biodiversity net gain starts moving up the agenda as a potential funding mechanism, how can or whether it can include natural colonisation. We need to think about how we integrate management. We need to think about, if we're doing it on our own land, how do we build good management for natural colonisation alongside our more traditional management of plantation woodlands. But also that links to what costs do we need to include in our grant mechanisms for landowners? What management do we want them to be doing, and what are reasonable costs? As we know at the moment, fencing costs are incredibly high. So, do we need to fence off natural colonisation areas or not? It's having better understanding around this. And last but very much not least, this is why it's so great to see the social side of this project, is actually how we manage expectations. And that can be through the public, who will visit a national forest site and have an expectation of seeing well-managed plantation woodland. And some people might see natural colonisation and perceive it as an absence of management. So we need to be getting the messaging right to these people, but also we need to be understanding how we explain and interpret natural colonisation to our funding partners, whether that's DEFRA or external funders, corporate funders, to people in planning authorities if we're using natural colonisation as part of biodiversity net gain. So for us, we probably have more questions than answers right now, and that's why we're delighted to be part of this project as it moves forward. Next slide, please. And basically that's it for me. You'll see my contact details there. We've got the Q&A later, but if you have any thoughts after the event, do feel free to drop me a line. So I will now hand over to Saul from the Woodland Trust, who can start to talk about their experience.
Great stuff. Thank you, Sam. Yeah, quite a few parallels, I would say, perhaps in what I'm going to talk about now. So essentially, sorry, I should introduce myself. I'm Saul. I'm the Outcomes Manager in the Conservation team at the Woodland Trust. I'm going to attempt to give a little bit of an overview of our woodland creation activity, particularly focusing on our estate. And then my colleague Fran is going to draw out some examples of work that we've done working with other landowners and partners off estate. I suspect more than anything, what I'm going to do is illustrate why this project is so important to us, and some of the areas where there's really a lack of good empirical evidence to support some of our current work and some of the principles that we advocate in terms of woodland creation. But what I would say is what's clear is that we've got a huge amount of collective experience across the Woodland Trust when it comes to woodland creation in all its forms. We think we've had a hand in something like half of all the native woodland creation that's gone on in the UK, certainly over the last 10 years or so. But really, woodland creation as a key activity, as a driving activity for the Woodland Trust, is about 25 years worth of work. That's when it really became a priority for the organisation. And even over that time, it's changed really significantly in very recent years. So perhaps in the last 10, particularly in the last 5 years, the scale of our projects, woodland creation projects on our estate, has changed really significantly. So from relatively small projects, if numerous, of a few hectares each, to a number of projects over the last few years and live ones right now, which could certainly be considered landscape scale in their own right. And the last thing I'll say on this slide before I get into some of the content is it's definitely fair to say, echoing Sam's observations for the National Forest, that at the Woodland Trust we've done a lot of tree planting, and we've delivered some great results. There are some fantastic planting projects that have been delivered, but also I'm sure some lessons that we've learned about some of the limitations of tree planting and some of the hazards indeed of setting tree number targets as kind of, you know, driving organisational activity and objectives. So if we can move on, Susanna, please. Okay, so although we've done a lot of tree planting, we've got lots of examples of woodland creation through other mechanisms as well. So lots of natural colonisation and indeed a number of direct seeding projects across our estate. What the map here actually shows are 122 compartments on our estate, which are recorded as having involved some extent, greater or lesser extent, of natural colonisation in the woodland creation plans for those compartments. So we've got a really broad geographical spread and a wide range of contexts. So lots of them are on lowland farmlands, but a real mix of arable and improved or less improved pasture. Lots of them are adjacent to and buffering ancient woodland sites, but also a number of much more remote upland sites where seed source and so on have perhaps been the limiting factor. But what I would say more than anything, despite this number of kind of case studies and examples and collective experience here, is what we see as a real lack of solid scientific evidence behind all of these projects. So these have tended to be, on the side of major woodland creation activity, funded tree planting work, often driven by the site manager's own interests and energy, and that monitoring has been very limited, very ad hoc, and that really it's challenging to draw, good principles from this that we can apply to other woodland creation projects. Move on again, please, Susanna. So yeah, it'd be great at this point to be offering you lots of graphs of number of stems per hectare and tree species composition, and indeed wildlife response to these 122 compartments across our estate, and it's not possible to do that. But what we can do are offer some really quite simple but compelling observations from these sites. And I suppose what I would say is personal reflection is that those 122 compartments tend to be used disproportionately in regional and national comms. They tend to be the case studies that get raised. They tend to be the woodland creation projects that people know about and talk about the most. And I've got just a few examples here, and Elisa has actually already mentioned these two. But on the previous slide, we had Watkins Wood, which is down in Devon and is a fabulous compartment of natural colonisation alongside planting there, a real contrast just in terms of colour and the buzz of inverts compared to adjacent planted sites. And then we've got, some photos of both the Havering extension to Hainault Forest and that natural colonisation site on the Hucking estate. Again, mixture of arable land and improved pasture, turned to natural colonisation on those, showing mixed results in terms of tree species composition and so on, but also some really quite extraordinary wildlife response. So some of the species that we might hope to see in the kind of complex scrub and tree mosaics that are developing on these sites, things like turtle dove recorded at Hucking, grizzled skipper on both of these sites, and so on. Okay, Susanna, we move on again. So I just want to very briefly talk about the fact that despite really good empirical evidence from these projects, we have felt confident to draw out some key principles. They're reflected in our suite of woodland creation guidance, the 3 publications that are shown here. And broadly, I suppose, what we're trying to encourage in our own activity and indeed where we work with others is greater use of natural colonisation, and particularly more creative use of tree planting using these different kind of structural approaches. So applied nucleation, variable density planting, all these kinds of things to try and promote greater structural complexity in woodland creation projects. I suppose one of the things that's interesting is another of the principles that we're trying to promote woodland creation for to drive nature recovery is the restoration of natural processes, and actually looking across a lot of our natural colonisation plots and sites, what we can observe there are things like restoring hydrological process and the introduction of large herbivores and grazing disturbance in those areas. So it really feels like there's a kind of shift of mindset that sees a number of our other conservation principles being delivered on in these projects alongside the use of natural colonisation. Thanks, Susanna. Let's just move on again, please. So yeah, just very briefly, I wanted to highlight one of a small suite of more structured trials and research projects that we've got going on our estate now. This is Pepperwood, an extension to a fantastic ancient woodland site that we own in the Black Country. And what we've got here is a much more structured trial, looking particularly at the effects of different ground preparation techniques on plots that are indeed adjacent to that ancient woodland. So seed sourcing and indeed colonisers of a range of species, not so much the limiting factor, but certainly herbivory and existing vegetation were the key factors. So we've got a whole suite of different ground prep methods, along with control sites and indeed some tree planting going on that site, and a really nice suite of monitoring of vegetation and soils with the support from forest research there. And I should just mention that one is all made possible because that site has really significant financial support from the Environment Agency who've supported us in that project. Okay, just one last slide from me before I pass on to Fran. I just wanted to highlight this point. So we're talking about natural colonisation, but I wanted to reflect back on some of our tree planting activity And I suppose the observation I want to make here is that we have, as I say, 25 years of tree planting work across the Woodland Trust, a huge number of sites. And I feel what we've tended to do is ignore woodland condition on those plots, to dismiss that as something that can't be applied to new woodland creation sites. So we've drawn metrics instead around things like tree numbers, mortality rates, tree establishment, those kinds of things. We're now getting to the point where lots of these sites are somewhere between 15, 20, 25 years old, well established, and are starting to look at woodland ecological condition and the condition assessment of these sites. And I think what that is starting to tell us very rapidly is that when you look at this suite of indicators, some of them listed on the left here, there are others obviously as well, but things like structural complexity, decaying wood, but also the opportunities for natural regeneration within the wood and for other plants and other animals to colonize the sites, we start to see some real limitations. And to highlight the resource requirements, the cost, the time and the skills that will be required to start to shift some of these sites into more favorable ecological condition. And that was my closing point. Thanks, Susanna. I will pass on to Fran.
Hello, I'm just waiting for my camera to switch on. Hello, I'm Fran Graham. I'm Woodland Creation Manager in the Northern Forest area for the Woodland Trust. So in addition to what Saul was saying, the Woodland Trust has outreach teams across the UK who provide advice and funding for other landowners. So they may be private landowners, NGOs, utility companies and others. And of those grant funding offers that we have at the moment, 2 of those include natural colonisation options. So the first one I'll mention is the bit that I'm involved in. So it's the Grow Back Greener grant in the Northern Forest, which is funded by DEFRA's Nature for Climate Fund, and it's a fund that Woodland Trust administer for DEFRA. And we've got a total target there of 790 hectares of all planting, and the project including 110 hectares of natural processes between over the last 2 years and until March 2025. So the uptake of that so far for natural processes, we've had 14 hectares across 6 sites started already, and then in our pipeline we've got 63 hectares across a further 12 sites at the moment for the rest of the project, and we're really interested in finding more. The other grant that Woodland Trust has got that's starting to involve natural processes is called Morewoods, and this is one of our national offers. And as a result of us sharing our experience in Grow Back Greener, but also estates sharing their experience, Morewoods have now started to include some limited options for natural processes in that grant, which is great. The next couple of slides I'm going to share are really looking at some examples of Grow Back Greener schemes so far. But quickly before I do that, I should say just a little bit about the Northern Forest. So the Northern Forest is a partnership that came together in 2016. It's a partnership between the Woodland Trust for Northern Community Forests, shown here, as well as the Community Forest Trust. And the area is enormous, over 10,000 square miles between Liverpool and Hull, going as far south as the bottom of the Peak District and as far north as the top of the Yorkshire Dales. So there's plenty of opportunities there for everybody involved. As a partnership, we've had 2 DEFRA grants so far, and our headline ambition is to establish at least 50 million new trees across the landscape over the next 25 years or so. And so far, we're getting close to 7 million now when you take into account this planting season just finished. Next slide, please. So Hot off the press is that the Northern Forest boundaries recently been aligned to administrative boundaries, which is far more sensible. So the blue dotted line is the old boundary. As you can see in the southern end, this was quite arbitrary, and the red dotted line is where that's been aligned to now, and that's all been agreed by all stakeholders and DEFRA, so that's really helpful. So in terms of the work that I'm involved in, next slide please, Susanna. So the work that we're doing is a close partnership between the Woodland Trust North Outreach officers across the Northern Forest area, and also 7 delivery partners. And together we're able to use our local knowledge and expertise to provide really good advice for landowners and work up some brilliant schemes. Next slide, please. So for all of our Grow Back Greener schemes, we go through a really rigorous process, and that involves looking at eligibility and vision objectives of the landowner, assessment, design, costings, delivery and monitoring. But in addition to that, for natural processes sites, we do a natural colonisation assessment, which is based on the Forestry Commission's Natural Colonisation Guidance Manual. So that's been really useful to us. And the key thing that we look at within that is whether it's the sites within 75 metres of a suitable seed source. And that's often the clincher to whether natural colonisation might be suitable on the site or not. So in addition to that assessment, we also work up a 10-year natural processes management plan with the landowner, and we offer monitoring that then carries on through the 10 years of the grant agreement to ensure that the grant requirements are achieved, and those requirements are that we get an additional 400 stems per hectare at 50 centimetre height or more. And when that's achieved, then the landowner gets a bonus payment. So if it's achieved by year 5, that's when they get it. If not, it's deferred to year 10 and reassessed at year 10. So this example, and I'll go through these briefly to make sure we keep enough time for questions, but this site is a site in Nidderdale AOB. The landowner was a private landowner, they're early adopters, they don't want to use any plastic, it's adjacent to ancient woodland. They had a tenant that had suitable cattle for ground preparation, and there's a wee photo there at the top. It hadn't been grazed for quite a long time. It was, well, some natural regeneration was starting in a very low level. It was quite rush dominated, so we did do ground preparation of cattle grazing to get that sward down and to open up some germination niches. The added benefit of this scheme is that we were able to fence not only the natural processes area, but also make sure that the adjacent fragments of ancient woodland were fenced off. So they are now stock proof as well. So it's really, really early days. We only started it last year. One of the issues that's been flagged up really is that while we can fund deer management over the 10 years of the agreement, for lots of landowners that's problematic, and I think that's an area that throughout the sector needs some careful thought and encouragement. Next slide please, Susanna. So the second site is very different. That first site was natural colonisation only. This site is a site in the Yorkshire Dales as part of the Wild Ingleborough project. When we did the assessment, we found there was insufficient adjacent seed source to rely on that entirely. It's very limited in the immediate area, and therefore we decided that direct seeding would be the best option. In Wild Ingleborough project, they have 2 natural processes sites, this one and one other, that have started already, and they're currently working at a 17-hectare site immediately adjacent to ancient woodland on limestone pavement. So there's some really exciting work going on. It is very experimental, but what the outcomes they're interested in is really multiple objectives. They would really like to restore woodland to the limestone pavement areas. but also achieve scattered trees on the rest of the site, so it forms a mosaic with grassland habitats. On this particular site, the grassland was very species poor and in bad condition, so the intention is to improve the ecological condition of the grassland while creating a mosaic with scattered trees, and then woodland started being denser among the limestone grikes areas. So as well as extensive grazing for ground prep, we're actually doing some very limited extensive grazing with hardy cattle at late summer, early autumn each year at just really low levels. And we're conscious this is very experimental, so we're interested to see how this goes over time. So just quickly, another couple of examples. Next slide, please, Susanna. So this is an example in South Yorkshire, developed by our delivery partner, South Yorkshire Woodland Partnership. In the assessment, they found that this is a really interesting site actually, because it's got adjacent woodland on all sides, which is fabulous. So they could be confident about natural colonisation happening at least around the edge of their parcel in the middle. But it's a site that's owned by City of Doncaster Council. It's amenity land. There will continue to be a lot of public access. Therefore, they've decided to maintain the desire lines as open space. And also they felt that because they've had a history of antisocial behaviour in the wider area, they felt that any conventional tree planting wouldn't be successful. And so the central area they've actually cultivated, as shown in the photo with the tractor, and they're doing direct seeding in that area, not only with tree seed, but also with wildflower seed. And they're doing signage and lots of community engagement. And the idea is that the wildflowers will be immediate impact, something nice for people to look at. They can see something positive is happening, and those trees are then going to gradually grow up through those wildflowers over time, so that people can see this is a changing process and something really positive. And the last example is a site near York on arable land adjacent to ancient woodland, developed by my colleague Alistair Fagan, one of our outreach officers. So this is in development at the moment. Its EIA is coming towards decision, and the 3 compartments adjacent to the ancient woodland in the north of the map there, we identified as being suitable for natural colonisation. The landowner was more comfortable with doing some conventional planting and supplementing that with natural colonisation. So they've agreed to plant at 1,100 stems per hectare, but do some ground preparation beforehand with chain harrowing, so that hopefully natural colonisation will fill in those gaps. And one of the benefits of that will be they'll very quickly get a little bit of a staggered age structure rather than it being uniform from the start. So lastly, from my perspective, so far we've seen mainly early adopters take up the natural processes option in Grow Back Green, the grant scheme. And the barriers seem to be the speed of establishment and the lack of confidence in achieving the grant requirements. And so what would be really helpful for us from this project would be to get more evidence about what works in terms of ground preparation and other factors, what doesn't work, and what are the timescales for establishment, so that we can increase confidence and get greater uptake. And that's all for me. Thank you. I'll pass back to Susanna for wrapping up. Thank you.
So thanks very much to all our speakers. That was a series of really interesting talks. If anybody in the audience has a question, please post it in the Q&A function. I'm sorry, I think the chat's actually disabled and I don't think I can enable it now. I'll do that next webinar. Oh, brilliant. We've got plenty of questions actually. So there's a question for Sam and Saul, could you say a bit more about what management has been put in place? Sorry, everyone. Could you say a bit more about what management has been put in place in your natural colonisation examples?
You want to go first, Saul? Because I have to confess, I probably can't answer this question.
So I think the problem with that is that it's you know, it's very mixed. As I say, these projects really have been driven by individual site managers with their own particular interests, and also in very different contexts. So often they're part of wider site management. So you know, the things specific to colonisation, like ground prep and fencing, are variable. But broadly, they're managed as part of our estate. So you can assume things like a reasonable level of deer control and other kind of, you know, UK forestry standard type approaches being common to all of the projects that are on our estate, at least. I'm not sure whether that's answering that question in the way that the person was hoping for at all, but it's the best I can do, I'm afraid.
Great, thank you. Sam, do you have anything to add, or?
This is the point I have to fess up and say I'm covering for someone else on this presentation. And so I can guess, but I'll be honest, I don't want to tell people wrong.
Yep. And then, thank you very much. And there's another question, which should be a quick one to answer. Is the Woodland Trust site assessment handbook available to share online?
It is. It's downloadable as a PDF from our website, and we also have a limited number of hard copies. If anybody wants to get in touch, we can share those.
Excellent, thank you. So we've still got a few minutes, and I don't think there are more questions from the audience yet. I've got a question which is a sort of thinking long term. How do you think productivity of timber or wood or any other products could come out of naturally colonised woodland, if at all, or would it need to be part of a blended approach?
I'll have a go answering that one, because I think it's really interesting. And the reason I think it's interesting is that when we were looking at our whole approach to woodland creation, one of the communities of interest, if you like, that we sought to engage with was the continuous cover forestry group and key practitioners in that sort of network. And essentially, we got no useful answers. That's not a criticism of anyone. I think it just reflects that people who are practicing CCF systems, for example, in the UK, have generally not done that from a woodland creation starting point. So we got loads of great experience and case studies of transforming regular stands into irregular silvicultural systems. Very, very few, if any, really meaningful ones of starting from scratch and creating that kind of structure. So it feels like that must be possible. There must be a quicker way of getting to an irregular silvicultural system than going for a regular plantation structure and then at some point in its establishment transforming it to an irregular structure. But yeah, lots to find out about that. And I think it'd be a really interesting area to get into in more depth.
Excellent, thank you. Right, we've got a couple more questions and not much time, but they're interesting, so we'll try and get through them quickly. Have there been any issues around tenant farmers or public perception with thistles, ragwort, and other things that could be perceived as unwanted weeds?
Shall I jump in on that one, Suzanne? I think this was very much what I was talking about towards the end of my bit. I think that people will see things like thistles, people will see, weeds, and perceive it as an absence of management. And I think it's very much around communicating that this is actually deliberate management. It is a choice, but we need to obviously explain why, but also the benefits. And again, I think this is where some of the research from this project will help us with that, not just with quantifying those benefits, but actually how to get those messages across to different audiences. So again, I think the sort of social side of this project that Elisa set out at the start is every bit as important as the biodiversity side of it as well.
Thank you very much. And finally, very quickly, how much is the agricultural legacy, such as high nutrients in soil, considered a barrier for natural colonisation? I know that Elisa touched on this briefly. Do you want to answer?
Yes, just to reiterate that, yeah, it's very important, and that's partly why it's really important that we study natural colonization processes in this country, in the UK context, because what we know is mainly coming from tropical regions, which have not been as heavily degraded or deforested for as long as most areas of the UK. So yeah, if we are trying to put woodland back into agricultural land, it's very likely that's going to have be nutrient-rich land that's going to lead to lots of competitive vegetation that will inhibit the establishment and germination of woody vegetation. So yeah, I think that's a big barrier in terms of doing some preparation and management of the areas that we're hoping to allow natural regeneration, colonization on, and some continuous management at the early stages to try and keep that competitive vegetation down to sort of kickstart the woodland development processes.
Excellent.
I don't know if Fran or someone with more sort of practical experience in that area wants to complement that.
I think for me, our schemes are too early to tell, to be honest, in that regard. Although of the sites, the 6 sites that we have started so far, I don't think nutrients has been an issue, to be honest. But it's a really good one to flag so we can be more aware of it in future. And we have got the flexibility within the grant scheme to be able to do management interventions that help to in ground prep or other interventions that can help manage that. So it's good to know about that one. Thank you.
Right, so I'm just going to finish up now with just briefly, sorry, we're overrunning slightly, saying that our the final arm of our research project, TreE PlaNat, is a knowledge exchange programme, which I'm working on with Mark Metzger at the University of Edinburgh, and we're bringing together our social and ecological research findings to ensure that our research is highly applicable and also provides outputs for people who would be able to use it. So every 3 months we're going to host a webinar. This is our first one, and we're also hosting blog posts every 3 months. Our first one was up last month on our website. And we've got various other things that we're doing throughout the project, like running a knowledge user board of land managers, and we'll produce various other outputs too. I know that a lot of you signed up to our mailing list when you signed up to the webinar, so you'll have updates on that. Otherwise, keep an eye on our website. And just thank you again to all the speakers for really interesting presentations. You can find their contact details here, and the webinar will be made available on our website later on as well, so you'll be able to find them there. So thanks very much for joining. I hope you found that informative. And thanks again to our speakers for some really interesting talks. Hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you.